Junior doctors in England prepare to strike again. The action is ostensibly over their contracts, but our health editor suggests the real reason is they don't think the NHS is going to be able to cope this winter unless the government drastically alters course.
This is devastating news for patients. Perhaps 100,000 operations will now have to be cancelled. Around 1 million hospital appointments will have to be postponed.
Meanwhile, the Cabinet is down at checkers, trying to work out what Brexit means. The PM tells her team there won't be any backsliding.
We're going to make a success of it. That means there's no second referendum, no attempts to sort of stay in the EU by the back door.
The Brexit ministers are talking about a bespoke deal. But what does that actually mean? Also on News at 10 tonight. If Brexit is forcing us to look further afield, how about Brazil? Tonight, the president there is impeached amid riots and allegations of systematic corruption. As Trump visits Mexico, where would he build the wall that is supposed to keep immigrants out?
The great debate about the value and the practicality of a border wall will rage above ground. But down here, you get a unique perspective. You understand that those with the resources, the hardened criminals and the smugglers, will always find a way through, or in this case, under the border.
And imagine a training session, let alone a race, where you could have a seizure at any moment. The extraordinary story of another medal hopeful in Rio.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. Throughout the summer, the festering row between the government and junior doctors in England has simmered on, but it never went away, and today it erupted again, arguably with more force than ever. The doctors' union said members will now stop work for 5 days in a row during office hours from a week on Monday, A&E included. More dates will follow. It is a pretty hard-hitting development, to say the least. The core of the dispute is still centred around those contracts due to be imposed in October, in theory at least. But it seems now to be about a lot more than that.
The NHS is facing unprecedented challenges. Waiting times are up, services are being suspended, budgets are under strain. And now this, another round of strikes, without doubt another symptom of the pressures facing our health service, while simultaneously multiplying the burden. Junior doctors are unrepentant.
The situation is due to the government's concept or manifesto pledge of a 7-day NHS, which they have proven that they have not costed, they've not funded it, they've not staffed it, and more important than anything else, they've not shown any evidence that actually it would work.
For a health secretary who thought he'd made enough concessions to win the union's backing for the new contract, it's almost unbelievable.
This is devastating news for patients. Perhaps 100,000 operations will now have to be cancelled. Around 1 million hospital appointments will have to be postponed, causing worry, distress and anxiety for families up and down the country.
Because the scale of the action planned is wider than ever before. 5 days of rolling strikes that consultants will have to try to cover. With the new contract due to roll out in October, the BMA has little time to get the government back to the negotiating table.
But it adds to the mounting number of pressures hospitals are facing. We now know of 18 trusts across England which have had to suspend or close down services, blaming a shortage of staff.
That's part of a backdrop of concern that's seen the NHS failing to meet its crucial 18-week waiting time since February. It's becoming clear some hospitals may have to close as part of plans to ensure the NHS remains sustainable in the face of an ageing population. And even before the strike was announced, the NHS admitted some operations may need to be cancelled this winter to cope with the inevitable rise in admissions. And many experts believe when you're running on goodwill, maintaining morale is crucial.
The key for the NHS is really to focus on making sure that it can recruit and retain staff. That is the most important priority for the NHS at the moment. It's key to financial stability, but it's fundamental to delivering the quality of care.
Whether the new contract will make things better or worse depends on whether you believe the government or the junior doctors. But as summer draws to an end, what is clear is this winter looks even more challenging than the last.
And Rachel joins me here in the studio now. Rachel, I mean, let's be honest, this feels like a really big development, doesn't it? How much, in your view, is about the contracts and how much about broader issues?
Well, that's one of the big questions here, and the British Medical Association has made it clear that as far as they're concerned, this still isn't a fair deal for junior doctors, particularly who work part-time and those who do the most weekends. But when you speak to those who are in the negotiations, when you speak to chief executives, there is a consensus actually this wasn't a bad deal. And remember, it was one that the same Junior Doctors Committee, albeit with a different chair, signed up to back in May. It was only when they put it to their members that it was rejected, albeit with a much less of a mandate than originally back when the first lot of industrial action began. So what is at stake here? I think it was really telling that the chair of the Junior Doctors Committee tonight said that she believed this would fuel the workforce crisis. There's been mounting evidence, hasn't there, over the past few weeks that staff within the NHS are being stretched more and more thinly. So they may have a point. The question is whether this is the right battleground to fight it on.
You said in your report this winter could be, tougher or more difficult than the last. What's your assessment of the kind of shape, particularly financially, the NHS is in going into this autumn and winter?
It's in a very difficult shape right now. Yes, Simon Stevens got the £10 billion from George Osborne, the former Chancellor, to try and get the NHS through the next 5 years. He said it would be enough, but that depended on social care being sorted out, on some of that money going into sustainability plans. Instead, it's had to be used to plug many hospital deficits, which continue to grow. So a 5-day rolling strike on top of that, when waiting times are already stretched, that's going to have an enormous cumulative effect. And I think it depends on exactly how bad things get as to whether the government is going to be more transparent about what the NHS really can and can't do. OK,
Rachel, thank you very much indeed. And if you have an operation booked or an appointment arranged for the week after next and want to know what are the chances it will still go ahead, there is advice over on our website. Do go and check it out. After a day of deliberation at Chequers, it is all clear. Theresa May's government is committed to taking Britain out of Europe, to some controls on immigration and to its own individual deal with the EU, not a copy of Norway or anyone else's. In short, the kind of outcome our European partners insist they will not be offering us. As Boris Johnson might say, we are still 100% for having our gâteau and eating it. But how is that going to be achieved? Carl Dinnan tries to work out whether today's meeting actually reached any conclusions.
Theresa May led her ministers to Chequers today for an end-of-summer cabinet away day. And amidst the 16th century splendour of the Prime Minister's country residence, she made clear there was no question that Britain is on the way out of the European Union.
We'll be looking at the next steps that we need to take, but we'll also be looking at the opportunities that are now open to us. We must continue to be very clear that Brexit means Brexit, that we're going to make a success of it. That means there's no second referendum, no attempts to sort of stay in the EU by the back door. We're actually going to deliver on this.
But Brexit presents a particularly tricky puzzle for Mrs May. She must piece together Britain's access to the EU single market, along with restrictions on the freedom of movement and which EU regulations the UK wants to hold on to. At the same time, she has to keep on board senior pro-Europeans like Philip Hammond and Amber Rudd, and Brexiteers like Boris Johnson and Liam Fox, who are already disagreeing with one another. This evening, Number 10 said that ministers had agreed Brexit should mean additional controls on migration from the European Union, but also a positive outcome for those who want to trade with the single market. They also said there is no need for a parliamentary vote before triggering Article 50, the formal process of Britain leaving the EU. Avoiding Parliament may be wise, because it's not just the ministers meeting at Chequers who are divided over Brexit. Tory backbenchers also disagree on how much free market access Britain needs to negotiate.
We need that access to the single market. I also want us to have the free movement of labour, because I believe in the positive advantages of immigration.
We don't need to negotiate very much at all. We wish to take back control. We want to control our own borders, spend our own money, and make our own laws outside the trade area.
At the Prime Minister's right hand today sat the Cabinet Secretary. His predecessor says this is one of the biggest jobs in living memory.
It involves negotiations covering all government departments. It will affect all of our lives, so this is probably one of the biggest challenges that the civil service and our government have faced certainly in my lifetime.
Returning to Downing Street this evening, that is the scale of the challenge facing Mrs May. And how well she meets it will likely define how her time in office will be remembered.
Well, as you saw there, Theresa May is back in Downing Street this evening, and Carl is also there. Carl, are we any closer to knowing how we will have our cake and eat it? Can we? And if so, how?
Well, it's going to be a very special British cake, we know that. It's going to be specially baked for this Brexit. It won't be like anyone else's deal. Now, the government wants, as I said in my report, to have some access, a positive outcome for those who want access to the single market, and some controls over freedom of movement. But the details are very vague, and it'll be the differences between those two things where the trouble comes. You've already heard Tory backbenchers today disagreeing on what the government should do next, and we all know how many Tory residents of this place have had problems and been brought low over Europe. So there's a long way to go before we're even in the position of having cake, never mind eating it. In fact, they're still drawing up the ingredients list now.
OK, Carl, thank you very much indeed. Now, in London today, one of those stories that remind us all in the most shocking way possible of the sometimes random nature of life and death. A high-speed police chase through suburban South London ended with a car suspected to have been stolen hitting a family walking along a pavement. A woman and a boy were killed and 3 girls badly injured. It happened in Penge, where the driver lost control just after 2 this afternoon. Local people rushed to help, and around 20 managed to lift the crashed car in an attempt to try and free those trapped underneath. Police have arrested the driver of the car. If you know anyone with a disease, you will be all too well aware of the utter misery it causes. But Britain is likely to have 1 million people with dementia within the next decade. In consequence, any sign of hope in combating the condition is quickly seized upon, and arguably, therefore, in any talk of progress, caution is the watchword. But a small study has found a new drug can actually remove the clumps of unwanted protein that build up on the brain of people with early-stage Alzheimer's dementia. No other drug has been able to do this. Now, a bigger trial is needed, and the numbers make it clear why. One person in the UK develops dementia every 3 minutes, believe it or not. That's 225,000 people this year alone, with numbers set to soar to 2 million by 2051. And roughly 2/3 of them, 62%, will have Alzheimer's itself. Juliet Bremner reports.
Scientists believe dementia is caused by the build-up of protein, sticky clumps of amyloid beta highlighted in red, which destroy the brain cells. But a new drug looks as if it can halt the spread, getting the immune system to remove the harmful protein. Joy Watson was diagnosed with Alzheimer's 3 years ago on her 55th birthday. Today's announcement that the drug, aducanumab, may halt the progress of her disease gives her and husband Tony renewed hope.
There's so much change, so much you have to adapt to. If there'd been a drug available when I was first diagnosed, I would have been jumping for joy, and so would my family, because we were all aware of what the future would hold.
So tell me about the DMAB.
This was an early trial, but at the Alzheimer's Research Drug Discovery Centre, they believe it's the most important step towards a treatment for more than a decade. Chief scientist Dr. David Reynolds stresses it's not a cure and won't help those with moderate or advanced Alzheimer's, but he thinks it's hugely significant.
We don't have any drugs that can slow down or stop those diseases. So if this drug works, then it will be the first what's called disease-modifying drug to come forward. So something that can actually slow down the disease. That is a really major step forward.
Brenda Whittle is part of an Alzheimer's trial in this country. She agreed to take part almost as soon as she was diagnosed.
Brenda did actually say, you know, even if it may be too late for me, and I hope it's not, we will certainly be helping other people.
Much bigger Phase 3 trials are now underway. They should be completed in 2020.
It would be fantastic if the positive signal we've seen in this drug comes to fruition, and if it does, then in the next 3 years we could have a game changer. But we have to wait and see what that trial shows.
Even if they are successful, early diagnosis like Brenda Whittle's will be key, allowing treatment to start before the brain has been irreversibly damaged. Juliet Bremner, News at 10.
In the spot where 4 nights ago a Polish man was fatally beaten up, the people of Harlow in Essex came together this evening. They wanted to show Arkadiusz Jóźwik the respect in death his killers clearly did not in life. His friends say he was attacked by a gang of teenagers simply for being Polish.
A minute's silence at a vigil on a shopping street in Essex, on the exact spot where a Polish man was beaten to death, and where a community has come together to ask why.
At the moment, the eyes of the country are on Harlow. We know that a lot of people are intimidated and worried.
Arkadiusz Jóźwik was killed after a violent attack last Saturday night. 6 teenagers have been arrested and bailed. This evening, all ages, all backgrounds gathered to demonstrate how most people live here quite happily, side by side. Was this a hate crime? Well, that's for the police and legal system to decide. But that question is being asked in the same breath as talk of Brexit and immigration. And as you can see, that's deeply troubling in a town with one of the highest concentrations of Eastern Europeans in the country. Paying his respects earlier today, the Polish ambassador. This murder of his countryman has shocked his nation.
It's a great tragedy, not only for Polish community, but also for British community.
Eric Hind knew Arkadiusz. He's convinced his friend was targeted because he was Polish.
We are not welcome here anymore. We've been given lots of kind of, sarcastic comments.
Like what?
Like, what time's your next bus? As I mentioned before, have you got a valid passport? This is just one of the outcomes. It shouldn't happen. Arek shouldn't die the way he died.
The Polish ambassador leaving a private meeting with the brother of Arkadiusz Jóźwik. The family today released a statement saying they were devastated by their loss. As darkness fell, the tributes continued to be paid to a Polish man whose death is raising deep concerns about life for European immigrants in post-Brexit Britain. Angus Walker, News at 10, Harlow, Essex.
It is perhaps fair to say that the first time Donald Trump made headlines around the world as a potential presidential candidate was when he talked about building a wall to keep out Mexicans and getting Mexico to pay for it. He mentioned it today on a surprise visit to Mexico, but he also spoke about the tremendous feeling he has for Mexican Americans. So, never mind about building walls, Mr. Trump certainly does have some bridges to build with Hispanic voters. The overwhelming majority, 65%, support his rival Hillary Clinton. Only 21% say they are likely to support Mr. Trump himself. Mr. Trump has said so many things, quite a lot of them rather inflammatory, that it is hard to know what he actually means to do in practice. But since he has talked repeatedly about building that wall between the US and Mexico, our Washington correspondent Robert Moore decided to assess what that would involve in reality.
Mr. President, I want to thank you. It's been a tremendous honor, and I call you a friend. Thank you.
This was one way to steal the headlines. Donald Trump flying to Mexico City to meet with the country's president, Peña Nieto.
Encontrará en México.
This was stepping into the lion's den for the Republican candidate. For Trump has insulted Mexicans, promised to deport 11 million undocumented workers, and made a massive border wall his signature policy.
We recognize and respect the right of either country to build a physical barrier or wall on any of its borders to stop the illegal movement of people, drugs, and weapons.
1,500 miles to the north, and you can see the human cost of a dysfunctional border, where there are routine scenes of separation and heartbreak. This man is struggling to touch his wife through the thick steel grills, finally reduced to kissing the tip of her finger. And nearby Yosinis is simply trying to make physical contact with her mother.
We can only touch the pad of her finger, you know, as opposed to, you know, meeting your mom every weekend, every day.
To millions of angry and fearful Americans, it is the outlandish promise that has turned Donald Trump into a folk hero.
That wall. Build that wall. Build that wall.
The existing border wall is 600 miles long. Trump proposes an impenetrable 2,000-mile barrier. If built, it would be perhaps the greatest construction project since the Great Wall of China. But could such a wall even work? Not according to the agents who patrol it. They point out that desperate people will always climb it. This was video shot of smugglers effortlessly scaling it.
Am I good to go?
And then there is the other way.
Okay.
Beneath the wall.
You're gonna go all the way down to the second landing on that same line. Okay.
I was granted access to a smuggler's tunnel that was built under the existing wall until it was discovered by chance.
Mexico that way, US of A that way.
The great debate about the value and the practicality of a border wall will rage above ground. But down here, you get a unique perspective. You understand that those with the resources, the hardened criminals and the smugglers, will always find a way through, or in this case, under the border.
The profit margin is absolutely astounding. They can push 32 tons of marijuana through here at a going rate in there, make about $60 million in one go.
But most of those who seek to cross are like Enrique, simply in search of a better life. He has just been deported from the US and vows to return, to be reunited with his 4 children, who remain in California.
No, jamás. Ninguna barra no hay.
I will cross, he says simply, because I must cross. It doesn't matter how dangerous it is to me. Enrique later looks longingly over the fence and back to America, making absolutely clear that no border wall, however formidable, will ever deter him. Robert Moore, News at 10, on the US-Mexican border.
For 9 months, tortuously, the power of Brazil's President Dilma Rousseff has been ebbing away and the business of government has been pretty much on hold. Today, she was finally put out of her misery, dispatched from office by Brazil's parliament for using money from state banks to boost public spending around election time, which, as accounting slates of hand go, is not actually that unusual in Brazil or anywhere else, you might say. But Brazil is a big and important developing country and one of those we expect to be doing more business with in the post-Brexit world. Our international affairs editor, Raghi Omar, is here to try and make sense of this for us. Raghi, what's the essence of this story?
Well, the essence is that, as you were stating, Dilma Rousseff, who has never lost an election, she's won twice, was accused by the Senate of Brazil of front-loading budgets ahead of her election in 2014 and trying to spread money around to sort of buy votes effectively. But what is really beneath this, and she's calling it a coup, is the fact that she has instigated and tried to uncover a huge bribery corruption scandal involving Petrobras, which is the major oil company and one of the drivers of Brazil's economic resurgence. A lot of those who actually have impeached her accused of crimes far worse than what she's been accused of, and she's described it as nothing more than a coup and a political execution.
And there's, as we've come to expect in politics here and elsewhere, there's a fair degree of skullduggery, personal and political, about this.
And it goes to the nth degree in this, and it's completely shattered a political union at the top of Brazilian politics because Dilma Rousseff and her vice president, Michel Temer, were the 2 closest political allies. You know, absolutely a political honeymoon, close physically there, but also politically as well. He has actually been in cahoots with those in Senate trying to undermine her and drive this impeachment proceedings. He's been on television election tonight. He's signed the articles of papers beginning the presidency. He's going to cover her remaining 2-year term. And he said that he's going to go to the G20 meeting to try and show the world Brazil has got political stability and is open for trade.
OK. A torturous but interesting tale. Thank you very much indeed. Now, I've got a spare £50 million to spend. Well, if you own a Premier League football club, you have just 30 minutes or so to buy another player before the transfer window closes at 11 p.m. Another big name on the move after today is David Luiz. Chelsea agreed to buy him back from Paris Saint-Germain for around £34 million. The total spent so far in this window, roughly £1 billion, the biggest in the history of football. 14 of the 20 Premier League clubs have broken their own transfer records, so not much of a sign of any kind of recession in football finances, you might say. When the Paralympics begin in just over 7 days' time in Rio, British competitors will be aiming, of course, to head for the winner's podium. And in many cases, if they get there, it will feel like the end of a journey completed over quite incredible odds. One woman who already knows what that feels like is double world paracycling champion Megan Jalea. At the time of the London Games 4 years ago, Megan was in full health, a sports coach. Then out of nowhere came a terrible stroke. Paracycling has provided a way back to physical and indeed mental strength. And as you'll see, every training session, let alone every race, is quite some journey in itself.
Speed, focus, balance. All that takes twice the energy for Megan Jalea. Because what you can't easily see is the injury to her brain.
Come on, Megan. Real positive weight movement.
If the normal brain has a full battery, someone with a head injury generally starts their day off on half a battery.
At 27 years old, a severe stroke threw Megan's world into chaos. She partially lost the use of her right side and was diagnosed with epilepsy. She still lives with countless side effects, including memory, speech and vision loss. Her relationship broke down and she had to start a new life emotionally as well as physically.
You go into a very dark area where you think, what's the point in life? If the people you care about the most can't cope, then how are you meant to cope? And I needed that belief in myself again, and I had to dig really deep to find it. I refer to myself as Megan the First, which is pre-stroke, and Megan the Second, which is post-stroke.
A key step in Megan's recovery was getting on a bike, at first having to strap her hand and foot to the frame.
Every step I take, I have to think about lifting my foot up and putting it down, or lifting my knee up so that I can get from one place to the other. It drains that battery a little bit more. By the end of a block of training, I've potentially had 3 or 4 seizures. I'm just sleeping all the time. I'm just tired.
So this is your stash room?
This is the stash room.
It's hard to believe Megan was a spectator at London 2012 and in full health. Now, just 3 years after her stroke, she's packed for Rio.
I suppose it's a little bit surreal. It really still hasn't sunk in until I use it. It's a weird shoulder.
For Megan, her condition is a daily gamble.
How are you feeling, Megan? Knackered, absolutely knackered.
This is just her second training session after 3 weeks in hospital.
Some days I can be walking fine, maybe, and just look like I've got a limp. Other days I'm on a crutch, 2 crutches. I have to use like a kid's push scooter to get me around some days. And then there's other days where I'm in a wheelchair.
Megan's unpredictable condition can change everything on race day. Nothing, though, can knock her determination.
If I had my way, I'd want 4 goals. I think anyone competing in 4 events would want 4 goals. People will see that, actually, no matter what you go through, there is always a positive that can be found.
And it seems the positive spirit that's got her this far has no limits. Sally Lockwood, News at 10.
Story of the day. Dogs can speak English. Yes, they can. You probably thought they could possibly determine tone or even basic sounds. Sit, obviously, heel. Not that all of our dogs pay a lot of attention, but there we are. However, we are all wrong. Researchers in Hungary say that they have concluded dogs are capable of understanding words regardless of the tone in which they are spoken. Sure you all have views on that. So there we are. Let's just take a quick look at tomorrow. There'll be that speech on immigration from Donald Trump, and the rediscovered Beatrix Potter book, The Tale of Kitty in Boots, no less, will be published more than 100 years after it was written. I will be here for that and much more. But for now, good night, and thanks very much for watching.